Hey guys, Jake Steele, Iron and Steel. This is podcast episode number 3, and thank you for being here. If you haven't listened to the first two, I would first of all recommend going back and listening to them, of course. But if you're just sort of stumbling onto this for the first time, the premise is basically I'm choosing stories that I've written and published on my website, which is ironandsteel.com, and I'm just sort of choosing those at random, reading them aloud, and releasing them as a series of podcasts to essentially give you guys another option to consume the content, basically. So that's the whole deal. I know every slapdick in the world has a podcast now. I guess just throw me on the heap. But I think you'll find this a little bit different. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. And again, a lot of these are firsthand stories, but some are also stories that I've written about other people, their cars, their journey, their experiences. And so it should be fun. Again, ironandsteel.com is the website. This is a story called No Dice Nomad. Originally, I was intending to tell a completely different story, and then for some reason at the very last minute, like literally as I picked up the microphone and all the stuff to record this, I decided I was going to tell this story instead. So No Dice Nomad is the story. It's about a all black 56 Chevy Nomad that I found in a lean-to about 10 or 12 years ago, and essentially tried to buy for all that time. And last summer I was able to finally buy the car. Unfortunately, from the widow of the guy who owned it. He passed away sadly last year. But anyway, I was able to buy the car along with a few others, and it's kind of a neat story. So again, ironandsteel.com is the site if you want to go there and check it out. Otherwise, you're welcome to listen in here. And yeah, buckle up. Here's how it went down. You know, my grandfather has a bunch of old cars. Look, if you want to get my attention, that's probably the best way to do it. I'd already known Brian for a few months before he dropped this little nugget of info on me. I was working at a Ford dealership at the time, and he had just started there as a technician. He's a nice guy, younger than me, and I guess I was probably 30, 31 at the time, something like that. Anyway, after a little prodding, Brian finally filled me in. It seemed his grandfather had a pretty eclectic collection of cars. From the sound of it, there was a little bit of everything spread out over multiple different properties, one of which actually belonged to Brian at this time. It's where he lived. His grandfather had cars stuffed away in shops and outbuildings all over the place from what I was gathering. It sounded perfect. Look, I didn't make any secret about the fact that I'd like to come see these cars. About once a week, I'd ask Brian when a good time would be to come by. Every time I brought it up, he would just assure me that it would happen sometime soon. I think it was about 3 months or so of this when, out of the blue, Brian, who was leaving work on a Friday night, asked, "Do you want to come by for a beer on your way home? Maybe see some cars?" Hell yes, I did. I happily followed Brian to his house, which was only a few miles away. I pulled into his driveway, and right away I realized I'd driven by this property before. I knew there were cars back there, but I had never stopped, and I didn't know what all was really hiding back there. Today, I'd finally find out. We get out and walk around into the back field. Right away, it becomes obvious there's a lot of stuff here. I mean, a lot. And a little bit of everything. On the way in, I see a really nice looking 55 Chevy. It's a 2-door post. It's just a body sitting on the ground. Then another 55 Chevy. This is an old race car. It's got a tilt glass nose, radius rear wheel wells. It's got a full cage, the whole thing. There's no motor, no tranny in it. It's just sitting there. Just sitting in the field. I think to myself, wow, okay, well, what else is here? Walking back toward the house, in a lean-to jetting off the backside of the main shop, I spot something I hadn't seen on the way in. From about 100 yards, I could just barely make out that it was a Tri-5 Chevy. I asked Brian, "What's in there?" He doesn't answer right away, but as we get closer, just as I'm realizing what it is, he finally replies, "That," he says, "is the Nomad." These 3 words kicked off a nearly decade-long saga of chasing after a car I just knew I had to have. Look, In terms of old car finds, this was pretty high up on the scale. An all-black 1956 Chevy Nomad sitting undercover in a tucked-away spot, far removed from the prying eyes of so many others that would have just loved to have found it. It was complete. Motor, transmission, interior, everything. It looked like it had been driven into the spot where it sat. It was one of those things that right away, it just spoke to me. I couldn't let it sit there another second. I had to have it. I had to save it. I couldn't let it deteriorate any further. In my mind, there was no question about it. I was going to drag this car home. Little did I know, it was going to be a while. Brian, what's the deal with this car? Now, if I were trying to hide my eagerness, I wasn't doing a very good job. Brian, on the other hand, seemed a little less enthusiastic than me. With a shrug, he said, "It's just one of my grandfather's cars. It just sits here." I could see a slight smirk on his face that let me know that he at least appreciated the fact that I was excited about it. But it became clear pretty quickly that there wasn't much he could do about it. I pressed on. "Can I buy this car? Would he sell it? How do I make this happen?" Now, look, I've learned the art of patience at least somewhat since then, but at this time in my life, I didn't know the meaning of the word. Okay, so can we call him?" I asked Brian. By this point, he's just kind of staring at me. Now, my expectation was that we were going to go ahead and wrap this thing up right now. I just knew I'd be going home to get my trailer right then. We'd be pulling this car out. Yep, no problem. I'd surely be washing off the layer of green algae that time had let obscure this beautiful black paint by sundown. Now, looking back, it makes me chuckle, really. Like I was the first dickhead that rattled around and offered to buy this car, as if he simply hadn't sold it all these years because nobody had thought to ask. Right. Brian says, I'll talk to him about it, but he doesn't really sell stuff. Right, well, of course, but surely he will sell this one, right? To me, right? Has to be. He goes on, "Well, look, if it makes you feel any better, this car's been sitting here for a long time. It's not like it's going anywhere, so you don't have to worry about it disappearing or anything." It did not make me feel any better at all whatsoever. My first order of business was to try to get an audience with Brian's grandfather. I didn't have to wait very long to meet him in person, but it didn't exactly go the way I had imagined it. His name is Rex. He's a big guy, stout. He's got a white beard and a weathered face that tells you two things right off the bat. Number one, he's a nice guy. But number two, he's not someone you want to mess with. He has sort of a grizzled old sea captain type of look, like the kind of guy that knows how to tie 50 different kinds of knots or navigate by the stars. His hands are huge and powerful. He's the kind of old-timer that shakes your hand and lets you know that he could crush it if he wanted to. And he looks you in the eye to make sure that that's not going to be necessary. Rex is a guy you'd want to have on your side, and not the kind of guy you'd want to be on the receiving end of a punch from. A real man's man. I liked him right away. The feeling was not mutual. Rex came into the Ford store to pick something up and to chat with Brian for a minute. I saw my chance and went over to introduce myself. "This is Jake. He's the guy that I told you wants to buy your Nomad." Brian cut right to the chase. I shook Rex's hand. He sized me up. His reply was simple. "Oh, I see. Well, nice to meet you." Then he went back to his conversation with Brian, and that was that. It was clear that he wasn't exactly interested in scheduling a time for pickup right then, and I just sort of stood there like a fucking doofus for a minute or two, and then finally I choked out, "Well, nice to meet you." And I slinked away wondering what had just happened. No dice. Round one, Rex. Really, it wouldn't just be round one. It was every round. I ran into Rex many more times over the span of several years. I would see him at swap meets or when he would come into the store to see Brian. He was always equal parts pleasant and disinterested in talking about the Nomad. It became clear pretty quickly that this was not going to be something that happened on my terms, if at all. I stopped even mentioning the car to Rex. He knew I wanted it. He just wasn't interested in selling it, or even discussing it for that matter. While I did give up on approaching Rex, every so often I would remind Brian that I'd really love to buy that car, with the hope that he would relay that message back to his grandfather. I hoped that one day, one of those times, he would say, "Ah, hell, tell him to come and get it." He never did. This went on for months, then ultimately years. Rex never said those words. Every so often, I'd find an excuse to make it over there, to Brian's house, and he'd say something like, "You just want to come by and check on your car, don't you?" Yeah, I did. Fast forward almost 10 years. It was summertime, and I had just gotten back from California after spending a week with my friend Brandon and his crew at East Bay Speed and Custom. I had left my 36 three-window down there for a haircut and turned it into a sort of a mini vacation. I spent a week with those guys in their shop, prepping, cutting the roof off my car, and setting the profile. I was in good spirits, still reeling from that awesome trip, but I was happy to be home. I get a text from Brian. The text says, "Hey, what do you know about mid-60s Chevy and GMC trucks?" Now, this is kind of an odd question coming from Brian. So I'm texting with him, and he starts talking about a guy that wants to come over and look through some parts that he had given to Rex some years earlier. Okay. So I'm trying to figure out what he's talking about and or why he would need my help. Eventually, Brian put it into focus. He said, "I'm sure you heard my grandfather passed away." Now, maybe you're thinking this is the part where I talk about how I get all excited that I'm going to finally have a shot at buying a car that I wanted. But honestly, it was the furthest thing from my mind. The part that I left out up to this point was that Brian was extremely close with his grandfather. I knew this was a devastating event for him, though he did his best to conceal that fact. The Nomad, on the other hand, was just a thing, and it was a thing that could wait. I wasn't about to bring that car up. It turns out I wouldn't have to. About a month goes by and I get another text from Brian. The text says, "A guy's been coming around trying to buy all three of those Chevys. He made an offer." Okay. Apparently, not everyone shared my let the family grieve stance. Now, I find this happening a lot these days as less and less people seem to know how to conduct themselves anymore. And I've lost out on a deal or two in the name of not being that guy. But in this case, I wasn't terribly worried about it since I knew Brian pretty well by this point. I told him, "Just let me know when your grandmother's ready and I'll make an offer of my own." A little while later, I get another text from Brian, this time with a suggestion. It said, "Why don't you go ahead and make an offer on whatever cars you want to buy, stick it in an email so she has it in writing, and I'll talk to her in the meantime." Now, by this time, there were plenty of other people swarming around various cars trying to buy them. The Nomad was definitely one of them. It was Grandma's decision, but Brian promised to make sure that I was at the top of the list. Ultimately, I wrote an offer for all three of the Tri-5 Chevys that were there. I also went to meet with Brian's grandmother, Lana. I wanted to let her know what my intentions were for the car, especially the Nomad. When I left, she promised to be in touch with me soon, and I parted ways with Brian kind of giving me the "I'll handle it" nod, as I thanked them both. Now, the only thing left to do was to wait. So at this point, remember, I had been chasing this Nomad for almost a decade. I kind of figured whatever amount of time she needed to think things over would be a breeze, but I was wrong. A day went by, then 2, then 3, 4, a week, 2 weeks. I tried checking in with Brian as often as I could without being a total pain in the ass, and he did his best to encourage me that I should just be patient. He said, "I'm confident that she will accept your offer." Finally, after almost 3 excruciating weeks, a phone call from Lana. She said, "Jake, I will accept your offer on the 3 Chevys." I thanked her repeatedly and made arrangements to pick them up the following day. My next call was to my buddy Robbie. I said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" His response was, "Picking up 3 bitchin' cars?" Yep, exactly. The next day, I picked up Robbie and we headed out to Lana's house to grab the first of 3 cars. Now, by this time, the Nomad had long since been removed from that lean-to on Brian's property where I found it. They had pulled it out, washed it, and stuck it in the barn at Lana and Rex's house. It had sat there just long enough to collect a new layer of neglect, this time dust rather than moss. It looked perfect sitting in the barn, and even better once I pulled it out into the sun. As I strapped it down to the trailer, I couldn't help but think about what a long process it had been to get to that point. This was a car that I knew from the first moment I saw it would be mine. And now, after all these years, and after almost losing hope that it would ever happen, it finally was. As painfully long of a process as it may have been, it was all worth it in the end. I was happy that Robbie was there when I went to pick it up, to help me extract it, load it on the trailer, and take it home. It was a day neither one of us will ever forget. And that's it. That's how it came to be. There you have it. No Dice Nomad. Thanks for listening to that. So, just a sidebar, the 36.3 window that I'm referencing in that story briefly is the car from the estate sale article, which is on the website, of course, but that's the article that I read in podcast number 1. So again, if you haven't listened to episodes 1 and 2, I would definitely recommend going back and listening to those. And again, estate sale is the first podcast episode, and that's the subject of that article and that story is that 36 I mentioned in this story. So kind of a little tie in there, but on the subject of the Nomad itself, I went onto the site and looked, and within that article there are actually 22 photos from the process of pulling the car out, pulling it out of the barn, it seeing the light of day for the first time, and those types of things. So loading it on the trailer and all that stuff. So all those photos are on the website, ironandsteel.com. The other interesting thing too is I remember taking pictures of that car the very first time I ever encountered it, 10, 11 years ago. This was 2011 when I very first saw that car. And so the first part of that story, when I'm talking about going to Brian's house the first time, seeing the cars, and then encountering that Nomad for the first time in the lean-to at Brian's house, there are photos from that day, and those are in the article too. So kind of interesting to put the images with the story, and it just kind of ties it all together. So yeah, ironandsteel.com. The other 2 cars that I bought at that same time, 2 55s and the Nomad. So one of them they're both 55 2-door posts. One of them was an old race car. That belongs to Robbie now. And he's going to turn that car into kind of like basically a 2-lane blacktop style car. It has radius wheel wells, and it already kind of looks like that car, but he's going to put magnesium wheels on it, make it streetable, drag race it, but I'll also be able to drive it on the street. So that's what is happening with that car. There's pictures of that one in the article as well. And then the other one was just a body. It was just sitting on the ground, but it was really a nice car. We actually took that body and we basically turned that into a car. We bought a chassis and made it roll and steer and all that stuff. And then a guy here locally bought it and is apparently going to build a race car out of it too. So both of the 255s are going to be on the street or the track or both, allegedly shortly. So that'll be interesting. And then the Nomad itself, my plan for that, it has like old black paint on it, and it's in pretty good shape. It could stand to be buffed, but the car's not rusty. It's not dented up. It's just a nice old car. So I think I'm just going to buff the paint, and then I'm going to put disc brakes on the front, lower it, maybe some magnesium wheels. But the important thing is it's going to get a nasty small block, blower motor, 4-speed, line lock, the whole deal. And I just want to go everywhere in that car completely sideways, blowing the tires, and just have fun with it. So that's the plan for it. So yeah, stay tuned for that, and I'll update the story or write an updated article and or an updated podcast when that happens. But yeah, in the meantime, thanks again for listening. ironandsteel.com again is the website. Everything on there is free. All the content's free. There's 30 plus articles on there. All of those are free. There's photos, articles, all sorts of stuff. All that content doesn't cost anything. If you do want to support Iron and Steel, there is some merch on that website, t-shirts and things like that. They're pretty cool. So I would recommend, you'll just have to go check it out for yourself. But there's a couple different options, and I think they're both pretty cool. So ironandsteel.com. And again, thanks for being here, and we'll see you here shortly with the next one.